Hey there. So I enjoyed the first chapter so much. I wanted to get back and hop right into the second chapter without any delay. Hillbillies like to add their own twist on many words. We call minnows minners and crayfish crawdads. Hollow is defined as a valley or basin, but I've never said the word hollow unless I've had to explain to a friend what I mean when I say holler. Other people have all kinds of names for their grandparents: grandpa, nana, pawpaw, granny, and so on. Yet, I've never heard anyone say mama pronounced as ma'am, aw, or pawpaw outside of our community. These names belong only to hillbilly grandparents. My grandparents, Mama and Papa, were without question or qualification the best thing that ever happened to me. They spent the last 2 decades of their lives showing me the value of love and stability and teaching me the life lessons that most people learn from their parents. Both did their part to ensure that I had the self-confidence and the right opportunity to get a fair shot at the American dream. But I doubt that as children, Jim Vance and Bonnie Blanton ever expected much out of their own lives. How could they? Appalachian Hills and single room K through 12 schoolhouse don't tend to foster big dreams. The sacrifices that he so dotes upon his grandparents and the love that he received from them really makes me emotional, because when you have that feeling that you know you're missing something from your parents and that someone jumps in and gives you the best that they have, even though at the time you resist it, even though you don't want to be told what to do, even though the discipline is hard, looking back, it's the most valuable thing you can receive. So much so that you can't even, there's no way to thank them. There's nothing that you can do except for be a good person, pay it forward in the best way you can to someone else that comes into your life. But it makes all the difference, and I can see exactly why JD just holds his grandparents in such high regard. We don't know much about Pawpaw's early years, and I doubt that will ever change. We do know that he was something of hillbilly royalty. Papa's distant cousin, also Jim Vance, married into the Hatfield family and joined a group of former Confederate soldiers and sympathizers called the Wildcats. When Cousin Jim murdered former Union soldier Asa Harmon McCoy, he kicked off one of the most famous family feuds in American history, the Civil War. Papa was born James Lee Vance in 1929. His middle name a tribute to his father, Lee Vance. Lee died just a few months after Papa's birth, so Papa's overwhelmed mother, Goldie, sent him to live with her father, Pap Toby, a strict man with a small timber business. Though Goldie sent money occasionally, she rarely visited her young son. Papa would live with Toby in Jackson, Kentucky for the first 17 years of his life. Pap Toby had a tiny 2-room house just a few hundred yards from the Blantons. Blaney and Hattie and their 8 children. Hattie felt sorry for the young motherless boy and became a surrogate mother to my grandfather Jim. and became a surrogate mother to my grandfather. Jim soon became an extra member of the family. He spent most of his free time running around with the Blanton boys, and he ate most of his meals in the Hattie's kitchen. It was only natural that he'd eventually marry her oldest daughter. Jim married into a rowdy crew. The Blantons were a famous group in Brehert. I don't know this word, and I have to look it up, so I'm sorry for butchering it. But it's the nickname for where they live in Jackson, Kentucky. And they had a feuding history nearly as illustrative as Papa's. Mama's great-grandfather had been elected county judge at the beginning of the 20th century, but only after her grandfather. Tilden, the son of the judge, killed a member of a rival family on election day. In a New York Times story about the violent feud, two things leaped out. The first is that Tilden never went to jail for the crime. The second is that, as the Times reported, complications were expected. I would imagine so. When I first read this gruesome story in one of the country's most circulated newspapers, I felt one emotion above all the rest: pride. It's unlikely that any other ancestor of mine has ever appeared in the New York Times. Even if they had, I doubt that any deed would make me as proud as a successful feud. And one that could have swung an election, no less. As Mama used to say, you can take the boy out of Kentucky, but you can't take the Kentucky out of the boy. I can't imagine what Papa was thinking. Mama came from a family that would shoot at you rather than argue with you. Her father was a scary old hillbilly with the mouth and war medals of a sailor. Her grandfather's murderous exploits were impressive enough to make the pages of the New York Times. And as scary as her lineage was, Mama Bonnie herself was so terrifying that many decades later, a Marine Corps recruiter would tell me that I'd find boot camp easier than living at home. Those drill instructors are mean, he said, but not like that grandma of yours. That meanness wasn't enough to dissuade my grandfather. So Mama and Papa were married as teenagers in Jackson in 1947. At that time, as the post-World War II euphoria wore off and people began to adjust to a world at peace, there were two types of people in Jackson: those who uprooted their lives and planted them in the industrial powerhouse of the new America, and those who didn't. At the tender ages of 14 and 17, my grandparents had decided which group to join. As Papa once told me, the sole option for many of his friends was to work in the mines, mining coal not far from Jackson. Those who stayed in Jackson spent their lives on the edge of poverty, if not submerged in it. So soon after marrying, Papa uprooted his young family and moved to Middleton, a small Ohio town with a rapidly growing industrialized economy. This is the story my grandparents told me. And like most family legends, it's largely true, but plays fast and loose with the details. On a recent trip to visit family in Jackson, my great-uncle Arch, Mama's brother-in-law, and the last of the generation of Jacksonians, introduced me to Bonnie South, a woman who'd spent all of her 84 years 100 yards from Mama's childhood home. Until Mamaw left for Ohio, Bonnie South was her best friend. And by Bonnie South's reckoning, Mamaw and Pawpaw's departure involved a bit more of a scandal than any of us realized. In 1946, Bonnie South and Pawpaw were lovers. I'm not sure what this meant in Jackson at the time, whether they were preparing for an engagement or just passing the time together. Bonnie had very little to say of Pawpaw, besides the fact that he was very handsome. The only other thing Bonnie South recalled was that at some point in 1946, Pawpaw cheated on Bonnie with her best friend, Mamaw. Mamaw was 13 and Pawpaw 16. But the affair produced a pregnancy, and that pregnancy added a number of pressures that made right now the time to leave Jackson. My intimidating, grizzled, war veteran grandfather, the Blanton brothers, who had already earned a reputation for defending Mamaw's honor, and the interconnected groups of gun-toting hillbillies who immediately knew all about Bonnie Blanton's pregnancy. Most important, Bonnie and Jim Vance would have another mouth to feed before they'd gotten used to feeding themselves. Mamaw and Pawpaw abruptly left for Dayton, Ohio, where they lived briefly before settling permanently in Middleton. In later years, Mamaw sometimes spoke of a daughter who died in infancy, and she led us all to believe that the daughter was born sometime after Uncle Jimmy, Mamaw and Pawpaw's eldest child. Mamaw suffered 8 miscarriages in the decade between Uncle Jimmy's birth and my mother's. But recently, my sister discovered a birth certificate for an infant, Vance, the aunt I never knew, who died so young that her birth certificate also lists her date of death. The baby who brought my grandparents to Ohio didn't survive her first week. On that birth certificate, the baby's broken-hearted mother lied about her age, only 14 at the time, and with a 17-year-old husband, she couldn't tell the truth, lest they ship her back to Jackson or send Pawpaw to jail. Mamaw's first foray into adulthood ended in tragedy. Today, I often wonder, without the baby, would she ever have left Jackson? Would she have run off with Jim Vance to a foreign territory? Mamaw's entire life and the trajectory of our family may have changed for a baby who lived only 6 days. What breaks my heart is that she was only 14. Carrying a baby the whole time and then losing it after delivering it. I can only imagine the heartache that she felt. And then when he says only 14 at the time with a 17-year-old husband, she couldn't tell the truth. Gosh, it just breaks my heart. Okay. Whatever mix of economic opportunity and family necessity whatever mix of economic opportunity and family necessity catapulted my grandparents to Ohio, they were there. And there was no going back. So Pawpaw found a job at Armco, a large steel company that aggressively recruited in eastern Kentucky coal country. Armco representatives would descend on towns like Jackson and promise, truthfully, a better life for those willing to move north and work in the mills. A special policy encouraged wholesale migration. Applicants with a family member working at Armco would move to the top of the employment list. Armco didn't just hire the young men of Appalachian Kentucky, they actively encouraged those men to bring their extended families. A number of industrial firms employed a similar strategy, and it appears to have worked. During that era, there were many Jacksons and Middletowns. Researchers have documented two major waves of migration from Appalachia to the industrial powerhouse economies in the Midwest. The first happened after World War I, when returning veterans found it nearly impossible to find work in the not yet industrialized mountains of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee. It ended as the Great Depression hit northern economies hard. My grandparents were part of the second wave, composed of returning veterans and the rapidly rising number of young adults in 1940s and 50s Appalachia. I don't know how to say it. As the economies of Kentucky and West Virginia lagged behind those of their neighbors, the mountains had only two products that the industrial economies of the North needed: coal and hill people. And Appalachia exported a lot of both. Precise numbers are tough to pin down because studies typically measure net out migration, as in the total number of people who left minus the number of people who came in. Many families constantly traveled back and forth, which skews the data. But it's certain that many millions of people traveled along the Hillbilly Highway, a metaphorical term that captured the opinion of Northerners who saw their cities and towns flooded with people like my grandparents. The scale of migration was staggering in the 1950s. 13 of every 100 Kentucky residents migrated out of the state. Some areas saw even greater immigration. Harlan County, for example, which was brought to fame by an Academy Award-winning documentary about coal strikes, lost 30% of its population to migration in the 1960s. Of Ohio, 10 million residents, 1 million were born in Kentucky, West Virginia, or Tennessee. This doesn't count the large number of migrants from elsewhere in the southern Appalachian Mountains. Nor does it include the children or grandchildren of migrants who were hill people to the core. There were undoubtedly many of these children and grandchildren, as hillbillies tended to have much higher birth rates than the native population. In short, my grandparents' experience was extremely common. Significant parts of an entire region picked up shop and moved north. Need more proof? Hop on a northbound highway in Kentucky or Tennessee the day after Thanksgiving or Christmas, and virtually every license plate you see comes from Ohio, Indiana, or Michigan. Cars full of hillbilly transplants returning home for the holidays. Mamaw's family participated in the migratory flow with gusto. Of her 7 siblings, Pet, Paul, and Gary moved to Indiana and worked in construction. Each owned a successful business and earned considerable wealth in the process. Rose, Betty, T. Berry, and David stayed behind. All of them struggled financially, though everyone but David managed a life of relative comfort by the standards of their community. The 4 who left died on a significantly higher rung of socioeconomic ladder than the 4 who stayed. As Papa knew when he was a young man, the best way up for a hillbilly was out. It was probably uncommon for my grandparents to be alone in their new city, but if Mama and Papa were isolated from their family, they were hardly segregated from Middleton's broader population. Most of the city's inhabitants had moved there for work in the new industrial plants, and most of these new workers were from Appalachia. The family-based hiring practice of the major industrial firms had their desired effects, and the results were predictable. All over the industrial Midwest, new communities of Appalachian transplants and their families sprang up, virtually out of nowhere. As one study noted, migration did not so much destroy neighborhoods and families as transport them. Okay, so wait a minute. Migration did not so much destroy neighborhoods and families as much as transport them. In the 1950s Middletown, my grandparents found themselves in a situation both new and familiar. New because they were, for the first time, cut off from an extended Appalachian support network to which they were accustomed. Familiar because they were still surrounded by hillbillies. God, I just love the whole hillbilly tone of this. I'd like to tell you how my grandparents thrived in their new environment, how they raised a successful family, and how they retired comfortably in middle class. But that's a partial truth. The full truth is that my grandparents struggled in their new life, and they continue to do so for decades. For starters, a remarkable stigma attached to the people who left the hills of Kentucky for a better life. Hillbillies have a phrase, too big for your britches, to describe those who think they're better than the stock they came from. For a long time after my grandparents came to Ohio, they heard exactly that phrase from people back home. The sense that they had abandoned their families was acute, and it was expected that whatever their responsibilities, they would return home regularly. This pattern was common among the Appalachian migrants. More than 9 in 10 would make visits home during the course of their lives, and more than 1 in 10 visited about once a month. My grandparents returned to Jackson often, sometimes on consecutive weekends, despite the fact that the trip in the 1950s required about 20 hours of driving. Economic mobility came with a lot of pressure, and it came with a lot of new responsibilities. That stigma came from both directions. Many of their new neighbors viewed them suspiciously. To the established middle class of white Ohioans, these hillbillies simply didn't belong. They had too many children. They welcomed their extended families into their homes for too long. On several occasions, Mama's brothers and sisters lived with her and Papa for months as they tried to find good work outside of the hills. In other words, many parts of their culture and customs met with roaring disapproval from the native Middletons. As one book, Appalachian Odyssey, notes about the influx of hill people to Detroit, it was not simply that the Appalachian migrants as rural strangers out of place in a city were upsetting to Midwestern urban whites. Rather, these migrants disrupted a broad set of assumptions held by northern whites about how white people appeared, spoke, and behaved. The disturbing aspect of hillbillies was their radicalness. Ostensibly, they were one of the same racial older whites as those who dominated economic, political, and social power in local and national arenas. But hillbilly shared many regional characteristics with the southern blacks arriving in Detroit. One of Papa's good friends, a hillbilly from Kentucky, whom he met in Ohio, became the mail carrier in their neighborhood. Not long after he moved, the mail carrier got embroiled in a battle with the Middleton governor over the flock of chickens that he kept in his yard. He treated them just as Mama had treated her chickens back in the holler. Every morning he collected all the eggs, and when his chicken population grew too large, he'd take a few of the old ones, wring their necks, and carve them up for meat right in his backyard. You can just imagine the well-bred housewife watching out the window in horror as her Kentucky-born neighbor slaughtered squawking chickens just a few feet away. My sister and I still call the old mail carrier the Chicken Man. And years later, even a mention of how the city government ganged up on the Chicken Man could inspire Mama's trademark vitriol. Fucking zoning laws. They can kiss my ruby red AS hole. I don't know the rules here, so I just am trying to censor any of the curse words in here. The move to Middleton created other problems as well. In the mountain homes of Jackson, privacy was more of a theory than a practice. Family, friends, and neighbors would barge into your home without much warning. Mothers would tell their daughters how to raise their children. Fathers would tell sons how to do their jobs. Brothers would tell brothers-in-laws how to treat their wives. Family life was something people learned on the fly with a lot of help from their neighbors. In Middleton, a man's home was his castle. However, that castle was empty for Mama and Papa. They brought an ancient family structure from the hills and tried to make it work in a world of privacy and nuclear families. They were newlyweds, but they didn't have anyone to teach them about marriage. They were parents, but there were no grandparents, aunts, uncles, or cousins to help them with the workload. The only nearby close relative was Papa's mother, Goldie. She was mostly a stranger to her own son, and Mama couldn't have held her in lower esteem for abandoning him. A few years after Mama and Papa began to adapt, Mama became close friends with the neighbor lady. That was her word for the neighbor she liked, who lived in a nearby apartment. Papa worked on cars in his spare time, and his co-workers slowly turned from colleagues to friends. In 1951, they welcomed a baby boy, my Uncle Jimmy, and showered him with their new material comforts. Jimmy, Mama would tell me later, could sit up at just 2 weeks, walk at 4 months, speak in complete sentences just after his first birthday, and read classic novels by the age of 3. A slight exaggeration, my uncle later admitted. They visited Mama's brother in Indianapolis and picnicked with their new friends. It was Uncle Jimmy told me, a typical middle-class life. Kind of boring by some standards, but happy in a way you appreciate only when you understand the consequences of not being boring. Okay, so that is a line Ben Shapiro has said in the past. I didn't realize it was the exact same thing, but when he talks about like what he's done over the weekend, his kids, and he's like, I work really hard so that I can have a boring life. And I can relate to that completely. It's an accomplishment to have a boring life. And that's the team that I'm on. Okay, which is not to say that things always proceeded smoothly. Once they traveled to the mall to buy Christmas presents with the holiday throng and let Jimmy roam so he could locate a toy he coveted. They were advertising it on television, he told me recently. It was a plastic console that looked like the dash of a jet fighter plane. You could shine a light or shoot darts. The whole idea was to pretend that you were a fighter pilot. Jimmy wandered into a pharmacy that happened to sell the toy. He picked it up and began to play with it. The store clerk wasn't happy. He told me to put the toy down and get out. Chastised young Jimmy stood outside in the cold until Mama and Papa strolled by and asked if he'd like to go inside the pharmacy. I can't, Jimmy told his father. Why? I just can't. Tell me why right now. He pointed at the clerk. That man got mad at me and told me to leave. I'm not allowed to go back inside. Mama and Papa stormed in, demanding an explanation for the clerk's rudeness. The clerk explained that Jimmy had been playing with an expensive toy. This toy, Papa asked. Picking up the toy, when the clerk nodded, Papa smashed it on the ground. Utter chaos ensued. As Uncle Jimmy explained, they went nuts. Dad threw another of the toys across the store and moved toward the clerk in a very menacing way. Mom started grabbing random shit off the shelves and throwing it all over the place. She's screaming, "Kick his effing A! Kick his effing A!" And then Dad leans in to this clerk and says very clearly, "If you say another word to my son, I will break your effing neck." This poor guy was completely terrified, and I just wanted to get the hell out of there. The man apologized, and the Vances continued with their Christmas shopping as if nothing had happened. So yes, even in their best times, Mama and Papa struggled to adapt. Middleton was a different world. Papa was supposed to go to work and complain politely to management about the rude pharmacy employees. Mama was expected to cook dinner, do laundry, and take care of the children. But sewing circles, picnics, and door-to-door vacuum salesmen were not suited to a woman who had almost killed a man at the tender age of 12. Mama had little help when the children were young and required constant supervision. And she had nothing else to do with her time. Decades later, she would remember how isolated she felt in the slow suburban crawl of mid-century Middleton. Of that era, she said with characteristic bluntness, women were just shit on all the time. Mama had her dreams, but never the opportunity to pursue them. Gosh, she was such a good person. There's a movie that you have to watch because I've cried. I've listened to the audiobook multiple times. I've cried during the movie, and just the heart that she had, I just cannot. My emotions overcome me. Okay, Mama had her dreams, but never the opportunity to pursue them. And I also just imagine, like, how proud she would be today to know that all of her hard work, she's the proudest Mama in Appalachia. Mama had her dreams, but never the opportunity to pursue them. Her greatest love was children. In both a specific sense, her children and grandchildren were the only things in the world she seemed to enjoy in old age. And a general one. She watched shows about abused, neglected, and missing kids, and used what little spare money she had to purchase shoes and school supplies for the neighborhood's poorest children. She seemed to feel the pain of neglected kids in a deeply personal way, and spoke often of how she hated people who mistreated children. I never understood where this sentiment came from. Whether she herself was abused as a child, perhaps, or whether she just regretted that her childhood had ended so abruptly. There's a story there, though I'll likely never hear it. That is a realization that I was able to talk about with one of my nieces just over the holiday. We were talking about, I think, the angel tree, and I was telling her how most of the Christmases I had that were memorable in the sense of gifts and stuff was from the angel tree. And it was during my mom's long stints in prison. And, she asked me about my childhood. And this is for the first time. She's like 23 now and pregnant. And I've been in her life her entire life, but it felt so sweet for her to ask me, because I think we, growing up as children, have assumptions just like he did. Like, he could feel some kind of sentiment where his grandmother had so much heart for the kids that were mistreated, in a sense that he felt there's probably a connection there between her childhood and the way that she spoke about mistreated children. And I feel the same way about my childhood and doing the angel tree every year, because I know how important those programs were when I was a kid, and what they meant to me when my family couldn't provide those kind of luxuries. So anyway, enough of my rambling and ranting. Mama dreamed of turning that passion into a career. As a children's attorney, serving as a voice for those who lacked one. She never pursued that dream, possibly because she didn't know what becoming an attorney took. Mama never spent a day in high school. She'd given birth to and buried a child before she could legally drive a car. Even if she'd known what was required, her new lifestyle offered little encouragement or opportunity for an aspiring law student with 3 children and a husband. And then JD goes to Yale. Oh my gosh. And to know that she wanted to be an attorney. Good Lord. That's God. That's God. Despite the setbacks, both of my grandparents had an almost religious faith in hard work and the American dream. Neither was under any illusion that wealth or privilege didn't matter in America. On politics, for example, Mama had one opinion. They're all a bunch of crooks. That is still very valid today, except hopefully in this next 4 years it won't be as true as it has been, but we all know they are dirty, stinky dogs, all of them. Okay, they're all a bunch of crooks. But Papa became a committed Democrat. He had no problem with Armco, but he and everyone like him hated the coal companies in Kentucky, thanks to a long history of labor strife. So to Papa and Mama, not all the rich people were bad, but all bad people were rich. Okay, and then that's another thing that's funny about, I don't know if anyone watches Theo Vaughn or listens to his podcast, but he always talks about how the effing rich and how he just like can't stand rich people, which it's not that exact, that's not the real definition of what it is, but it's like you despise people who give off that I'm better than you, or you ain't shit because you are not from anything. Like, you come from nothing and you are nothing. The people who have like that pedigree where they can just sniff out anybody who didn't come from money, it's like that kind of person can make someone who has come from nothing just their skin crawl. This attitude carried over to Mamaw. All politicians might be crooks, but if there were any exceptions, they were undoubtedly members of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They were undoubtedly members of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal coalition. Still, Mama and Papa believed that hard work mattered. I'm so sorry, and I wish I could be editing these out, but I'm just like, I'm not patient enough and I don't have an editing tool, so please forgive me. Still, Mama and Papa believed that hard work mattered more. They knew that life was a struggle, and though the odds were a bit longer for people like them, that fact didn't excuse failure. Never be like these effing losers who think the deck is stacked against them, my grandma often told me. You can do anything you want to. Oh my gosh, I want to shut up, but I can't. That is the difference. It's like if you believe that you're a victim, that because you were born in a certain situation, it's impossible for you to climb up the ladder. It's a lie meant to keep you where you are. And also, just because your trajectory to success might be a little bit longer of a distance, that doesn't make it impossible. And it even makes it more valuable, because when you get there, it tastes that much sweeter. You know, for the people who were born in a normal family that just had money to feed their kids and celebrate birthdays, that's an advantage. That's a huge advantage to those of us who didn't. And if I were to just sulk in the past, like some of my siblings, you know, I have siblings that have never forgiven our parents, that have never accepted what we were given as enough. They have grown up deficient because they can't accept what our situation was and just do the best that they can. They just wallow in the past or are addicted to drugs. But the American dream isn't about everybody starting at the same place. That's not feasible or doable. It's not about starting at the same place. It's about the opportunity that if you work even harder, you can get there. You know, we are all created equal, but we're not all born in a mansion. We're not all born going to private schools. And it's beautiful because even if you're born poor, on food stamps, on welfare, although it's going against the current and it's a lot harder, you have that opportunity. Like, no one could tell JD, I'm sorry, you can't be the vice president because you lived with your mama and survived off of her Social Security, and we kind of just don't accept your type. No, this fool is the literal vice president of the United States. And that is the most clear image and perfect example of the American dream, and that it is for everybody, no matter what circumstance you were born in, no matter if you went through foster care, no matter if your parents are gone, no matter what. Like, you believe in you and you can do anything, you know? It's nice to have other people that love and support you, but if you love and support yourself, that's more powerful than any advantage that you could be born with. So I'll just leave that right there. Okay. Their community shared this faith, and in the 1950s, that faith appeared well-founded. Within 2 generations, the transplanted hillbillies had largely caught up to the native population in terms of income and poverty level. Yet their financial success masked their cultural unease. And if my grandparents caught up economically, I wonder if they ever truly assimilated. They always had one foot in the new life and one foot in the old one. They solely acquired a small number of friends, but remained strongly rooted in their Kentucky homeland. They hated domestic animals and had little use for critters that were for eating. They had little use for critters that weren't for eating. Yet they eventually relented to the children's demand for dogs and cats. Their children, though, were different. My mom's generation was the first to grow up in the industrial Midwest, far from the deep twangs and one-room schools of the hills. They attended modern high schools with thousands of other students, To my grandparents, the goal was to get out of Kentucky and to give their kids a head start. The kids, in turn, were expected to do something with that head start. It didn't quite work out that way. Before Lyndon Johnson and the Appalachian Regional Commission brought new roads to southeastern Kentucky, the primary road from Jackson to Ohio was U.S. Route 23. So important was this road in the massive hillbilly migration that Dwight Yoakam penned a song about Northerners who castigated Appalachian children for learning the wrong 3 R's: reading, writing, Route 23. Yoakam's song about his own move from southeastern Kentucky could have come from Mama's diary. They thought reading, writing, Route 23 would take them to the good life that they had never seen. They didn't know that Old Highway would lead them to a world of misery. Mama and Papa may have made it out of Kentucky, but they and their children learned the hard way that Route 23 didn't lead where they hoped. Oh my gosh. And I love that because it's like there is no happily ever after, even with JD and his accomplishments in the political world and business world, and most of all in having a happy marriage. I mean, gosh, if that isn't the most rare gift of today is a happy marriage, I think that speaks to who he is and the type of person he is more than anything. But it's never just, yeah, we went from this terrible situation and made a decision and then everything was easy, breezy, beautiful after that. No, it's like every single turn in your life is full of trials, and that's what's sweet about it, you know? Going through those trials make every moment of peace that much more valuable. Gosh, so this is the 3rd chapter I've read today, and I could finish reading this entire book just because I love it so much. I love the story. I love his perspective of his upbringing and his family. So I may just keep reading, but thank you so much for tuning in. Please do like and subscribe. I'm not really going for a huge page. I'm really just on here to share these stories, and I feel like if I hadn't started my YouTube channel now, in 2 years I would be looking back again and thinking like, why didn't I start? If I had started when I had that first inkling to do it, this would be my 8th year in YouTubing. So yeah, anyways, I hope you enjoyed this chapter. We will start with chapter 3 next, and I look forward to it. Ciao.